Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out for what I hope promises to be a wonderful event. I have spent most of the day on your campus and have been welcomed warmly, and I want to begin with gratitude and thank both Ed and Sean Paulson for their kind invitations to come and participate on such a distinguished panel. And I'd like to thank the students who came to seminars this afternoon and some of whom were kind enough to have lunch with us afterwards. It's a pleasure to be here on your beautiful campus on a beautiful fall day. So the question for the event tonight is, who's in your wallet? I suppose it depends on whose wallet we're talking about. If it were my wallet, the answer would be no one. Why? I have 2 teenage daughters. And they feel at liberty to go into my wallet anytime they want to and take whatever they would like. And I have tried to make a deal with them, which is you can take whatever you want that's in there, but leave the Hamiltons in there. I think I've earned that one. But Hamilton disappears as well as everybody else. So let me begin with this. I will freely admit that when the assignment was given to say something about Hamilton and the 2016 election, I saw that as a difficult challenge. I know a fair amount about Alexander Hamilton, and as a political scientist, I know a good deal about this year's presidential election. But I'm not sure how to put the two together. Add the currency controversy to the mix, and the task gets even tougher. So let me begin with this preface. It is not an easy thing, or perhaps even a possible thing, to project Hamilton's views more than 2 centuries into the future of his own time. There was an American sociologist by the name of Robert Nisbet who wrote a book called The Present Age, and his comment in the introduction to that book may be fitting for our event this evening. He attempted to tell us what the American founders would think were they somehow magically projected into the future of our own time. He was writing in the 1980s. And he said that there were 3 things that would shock them. The first one was the centralization of power. The second one, the persistence of war. And the third one is something he called the loose individual, by which he meant human beings who were disconnected from community. And no doubt, those 3 aspects of American life have changed radically since the time of the framers. And there is, of course, more. So I want to condition the comments that I'm about to make, keeping in mind that one cannot help but be somewhat anachronistic in completing this assignment. And we use the word sometimes presentistic to suggest that we should not impose contemporary values on the past. Well, we're going to do, in a way, the reverse. And we're going to take values from the past and impose them in a way on our own time. That's never a perfect sort of transition. But nonetheless, here are some of my thoughts about connections between Alexander Hamilton and the 2016 presidential election. And I will tell you that most of my comments have to do with Donald Trump, because Donald Trump has been, in many respects, at least since Bernie Sanders exited the race, the big story about election 2016. I will keep in mind as I make these comments that there was a currency crisis, and as a backdrop to that currency crisis, I would like to remind the audience that it was Alexander Hamilton who pushed the nation to have a uniform currency, which did not exist under the Articles of Confederation. It was Alexander Hamilton who suggested that the artistry of what goes on our coins was important. It was Alexander Hamilton who suggested that presidents should be put on the face of our currency, and that Washington ought to be the first one to appear on our currency. So the thought that somehow Hamilton, the first Secretary of the Treasury, would be taken off of the $10 bill was appalling to me as a Hamilton scholar. But I think what saved Hamilton more than anything was the musical. So Hamilton is staying on the $10 bill, although the back of the bill is going to change. It will come out in 2020. On the back of the bill will be a number of suffragettes who were important in the women's movement in America. In my view, it would have been more appropriate to have an African American or an African American theme or Native American theme on the back of the bill, because Hamilton, as you may or may not know, was opposed to slavery. He belonged to manumission societies. He and his wife both worked to help Native Americans. In fact, Hamilton College in New York was named after Alexander Hamilton because of the work that he and his wife, Eliza, did with Native Americans. If the 2016 election is in part about the persistent challenge of race, then Hamilton is an appropriate figure to help us sort out the issues. For the reasons that I just explained, Thomas Jefferson is the one who often gets credit for being the champion of equality, but it's Hamilton in that generation who deserves more credit. But we should keep in mind that Hamilton was not an egalitarian, nor was he a Democrat with a small d. He was what today we might call an anti-populist, and this has been an election about populism. In foreign affairs, Hamilton was an advocate of what we might call level-headed realism. He did not favor American intervention in the French Revolutionary Wars when Thomas Jefferson and James Madison were agitating in favor of intervention. It was Hamilton who advised George Washington to pursue a policy of neutrality, and it was Hamilton who took to his pen, writing under the pseudonym Pacificus, to argue in defense of that neutrality proclamation. In this election, oddly enough, it's Donald Trump who resembles Hamilton more than Hillary Clinton. Why? Because Donald Trump has argued for a less interventionist foreign policy. Not always in the most articulate way, I will grant you. But it is Trump who has argued for a reconsideration of America's role in NATO. It's Trump who has argued for bringing American troops home from Japan, Germany, South Korea, and other parts of the world. In fact, it's Trump who has argued for the unbuilding of the American empire. So in foreign affairs, I would say that there are certain similarities between a Hamiltonian approach to foreign policy and some of what Donald Trump is saying. Hillary Clinton, by contrast, is much more of an interventionist, and so there are fewer similarities there. On trade policy, Donald Trump is interested in bringing manufacturing jobs back to the U.S. through, in part, the creation of different trade policies. Hamilton, you may know, was a great advocate of manufacturing and the diversification of the American economy. He wrote a famous paper on the encouragement of manufacturing in the United States. He even encouraged espionage, economic espionage, so that plans and the inner workings of manufacturing plants in England could be brought to the United States. But know that Alexander Hamilton was not ideologically driven in his advocacy of things like free markets and free trade. He was more of an economic nationalist. Donald Trump is somewhat of an economic nationalist. He is not an ideological proponent of free markets. One difference between Hamilton and Trump is Trump's recent announcement that he would favor a constitutional amendment placing term limits on members of Congress. Hamilton was opposed to term limits, especially on the executive branch, but he was opposed to term limits in principle. Why? Because he argued that representatives need to have distance from the popular will, and term limits would give the people more control of their representatives. Term limits were something advocated by the anti-federalists, really opponents of the very Constitution that Hamilton and others created. An additional disconnection between Hamilton and Donald Trump would be perhaps the most controversial part of Trump's candidacy that came to the fore during last evening's debate. And that is Trump's comments regarding the fairness of the election and whether or not he would accept the results of the election. He has mentioned the Second Amendment at times when he talks about the system being rigged, and some of his supporters have suggested that it ought to be used as a reaction to an unfair election outcome. There is an extent to which, however serious it is, that Trump is flirting with the idea of something like a rebellion. And there were few Americans who were more opposed to rebellion in the 18th century than Alexander Hamilton. He opposed Shays' Rebellion, which occurred just before the Constitutional Convention. He opposed Fry's Rebellion in Pennsylvania, and the Whiskey Rebellion, which he helped to put down in western Pennsylvania. Even during the Revolutionary War period, Hamilton opposed actions by the sons of the American Revolution when they ransacked the property of loyalists, including loyalist printers, who were publishing pamphlets and newspaper articles in favor of England. Hamilton argued at the time that the lawlessness of these rebels would make it difficult, if not possible, to rule the country in the aftermath of the war. Hamilton was concerned that once law and order broke down and a society moved towards anarchy, it would be difficult to put the pieces back together. So it was better to find solutions to problems than for it to reach the point of rebellion. Rebellion, in other words, was not something that one should be playful with or take lightly. Hamilton would be appalled, in addition to the last 2 points, by candidates in both political parties who tend to pander to voters. This is one of the big differences, to a large extent, between the 18th century and our own age. Washington never campaigned for the presidency, even though he won it 2 times by unanimous vote in the Electoral College. It was beneath the sorts of individuals that ought to occupy the highest offices in the land that they should go out before the people and try and convince them to vote for them, especially if it meant by pandering. And if you have been watching the presidential debates and the campaign, even just a little bit, you see quite a bit of pandering taking place. Candidates flip-flopping positions from the time of the primaries to the general election, all for the sake of winning votes. In Hamilton's view, that sort of behavior was unprincipled. The final connection between Hamilton and the election has to do with one of the things that he's best known for, and that is the economy and taxes. Both candidates, Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, have promoted economic policies in their campaigns that would increase the national debt. The national debt is something that Hamilton had a great deal to say about. And he said 2 things, 2 main things. The first one is often remembered, the second one is usually forgotten. The first one was that there are times when it is in the national interest and appropriate to run a national debt. 2 main areas justify it. One is national security, and the other is economic development. But the second comment that's often forgotten is that Hamilton said that too much debt is a bad thing, that persistent debt is a bad thing. And we live at a time when our federal government runs deficits year in and year out and has run a deficit up to approaching $20 trillion. Both of the plans, although not equal in the amount of debt that they would run, would violate, I think, the Hamiltonian principle of being prudent when it comes to debt. When it came to security, Hamilton was especially concerned that if a nation had too much debt, it would be difficult for it to borrow the money that would be necessary to fight a war. Wars are expensive, and it's inevitable during them that debt has to be run. So security depends in part on economic health and having a reasonably sized debt so that in an emergency, a nation can run debt if necessary. In terms of taxes, there are great differences between the two candidates. In the case of Trump, he is in favor of rather large tax cuts for both individuals and business. He's in favor of reducing regulation and renegotiating trade agreements, all as a way to try and prevent what he sees as the coming stagnation of the American economy. Trump is concerned that the American economy will become like many European economies and the Japanese economy, that it will run very low rates of economic growth. And he believes, rightly or wrongly, that an infusion provided by tax cuts, especially to business, would stimulate the economy and raise rates of economic growth, which would then pay for many of the spending programs and the cost of the tax cuts that are part of the Trump plan. The Clinton plan is different. It increases taxes on wealthier Americans. It leaves the tax rate for business where it is, and it does not it does not raise taxes for the middle class. The increase in taxes for the wealthiest taxpayers would go from 39.6%, where it is currently, to 43.6%. That would raise revenue, but not enough revenue to pay for the increases in spending in the rest of the Clinton plan. If I was assessing the two plans to say which one was more Hamiltonian, I suppose I would have to say because the Trump plan is geared at stimulating the economy, which the Clinton plan is not. The Clinton plan is based more on social justice, making sure that the wealthiest Americans pay their fair share of taxes. It's not intended to be a tax plan that stimulates the economy. There's probably more similarity in the Trump plan than there is in the Clinton plan. Now, some of these points, of course, are arguable, and when we get to the question and answer period, I would be happy to hear other sides of the argument, or if you'd like to engage in deeper conversation about any of these points, I would be happy to do so. But there are a few of the connections that I find between Alexander Hamilton's principle, his political ideas, and the 2016 presidential election. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael Federici. Our next speaker is Michael Lind.
I, too, am very grateful to be here, and I'd like to express my thanks to Ed and to Sean and to everyone involved in this program for this very timely discussion. Back in the 1990s, I had the great privilege of having drinks now and then with the late Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan of New York. And I used to rib him asking him how the Democrats, and this was in the 1990s, could continue to celebrate Jefferson-Jackson Day. This was the great Democratic Party event every year. And he never really had a good answer for this. In the last couple of years, Jefferson-Jackson Day has been abolished by one state Democratic Party after another, because nowadays Jefferson, the champion of states' rights, this is associated with the opposition to the Civil Rights Revolution in the 1950s and 60s. Jackson is thought of mainly for his rather despicable role in Cherokee removal from Georgia and the southern states, the Trail of Tears and the exile of the Cherokee to the Oklahoma Territory, which was a great atrocity. So the modern Democrats of 2016 think of Jackson as a racist, primarily. If you go back to 1936, during his second inauguration, Franklin Roosevelt did everything he could to associate himself iconographically with Andrew Jackson, to the extent that the reviewing stand in which he watched the second inauguration parade was a replica of the Hermitage, Andrew Jackson's plantation house. Well, why would Franklin Roosevelt, this patrician New York liberal, certainly by the standards of his day, try to associate himself with Andrew Jackson? Well, part of it was because he was a Democrat. And the Democrats at that point were still primarily an alliance of Southern whites with Northern Catholics. And Jackson had always been a hero of that tradition. But part of it because there was an attempt in the 1920s and 1930s to portray Jackson as the great egalitarian, as the champion of the ordinary individual, the small farmer, the small businessman, against the patrician elites, the well-born, the aristocrats. And there was some justification in that because the 1830s and 1840s, the age of Jacksonian democracy, saw the extension of universal adult white male suffrage. Suffrage for African Americans would come formally after the Civil War and in reality only in the 1960s, and suffrage for women in the 20th century. But that was still a revolutionary thing by the standards of the 19th century for all adult white males in a country without property to vote. It was also a period of what was called the rent wars in the Hudson River Valley, where there were tenant farmers who rebelled against the landlords. And so Jackson, even though he himself was a very wealthy Tennessee slave owner, did channel, a genuine movement to democratize what had been a system dominated by urban patriciates and by wealthy landlords in many of the states of the Union. So what I want to suggest is both of these images of Jackson are correct. The horrific racist image and the egalitarian image. And the way you reconcile these is to understand the nature of populism, at least in the United States, and there are parallels in other countries. So classic American populism has blended white ethnocentrism, white racism, with a high degree of egalitarianism within the white majority. So there's been no contradiction from the populist point of view to say that there's going to be this rigid line demarcating the white people, the real Americans, from African Americans, from Native Americans, from Mexican Americans, others. So there's this very strict border demarcating the white majority community from non-whites, but at the same time, class distinctions within the white community are illegitimate. And part of the power of the populist tradition has been this resentment of elites, and of economic elites in particular, and of the attribution of their wealth not to merit, but to manipulation of the political system. And if you read Jackson's July 1832 veto message, where he destroyed the second incarnation of Alexander Hamilton's Bank of the United States. He refused to recharter this. The Bank of the United States was not like a modern bank. It was sort of a proto-central bank. It was kind of like the Federal Reserve in a sense, but it was private. It was a government corporation, but it was run by private bankers. It had both, the shareholders were mostly rich Americans, and also overseas investors like the British. So if you read Andrew Jackson's veto message, it's portrayed as this corrupt institution which is trying to destroy the virtuous republic of the United States. And so, there's this sense. So you have the ethnic community, you have the classless society within the ethnic racial community, and finally you have outsiderism, this sense that this elite, this illegitimate elite, which for most of American history was associated with wealthy and educated elites on the Atlantic seaboard, is looking down their noses at the common people. And so their champion has to be someone who the elites of Harvard and Yale and Princeton and Manhattan and Wall Street despise. The more the Northeastern elite despises your populist champion, the more you like your champion. Your champion is a tribune of the people. And the greatest expression in American literature of this essentially Jacksonian kind of populism doesn't come from the Jacksonian era. It's a poem written by the poet Vachel Lindsay in 1919 about the defeat of William Jennings Bryan, the populist Democrat, in 1896, a few decades earlier, by William McKinley, the symbol of the Northeastern financial and industrial and mercantile forces. And I'll just read you, I recommend the entire thing. It's great to be recited. So first he pictures William Jennings Bryan, the boy orator of the Platte, whom the Northeastern elite of its day viewed as a complete barbarian, rather as they view Trump now. And he was going to destroy civilization and do in the gold standard, and America would collapse. And Lindsay, who was a populist from Springfield, Illinois, a Midwesterner, Bryan was his boyhood hero. So he says, Bryan, 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 gigantic troubadour speaking like a siege gun, smashing Plymouth Rock with his boulders from the west. And just 100 miles behind, tornadoes piled across the sky, blotting out sun and moon, a sign on high. So here you have the picture of the Midwestern populist hero. He's literally picking up boulders and smashing Plymouth Rock, where the ancestors of the great families of New England first stepped foot in America, showing the Yankees, who's boss, and behind him, all these prairie tornadoes coming to attack the East Coast. So, but of course, Bryan is crushed by McKinley. So then there's another stanza. Election night at midnight, boy Bryan's defeat. Defeat of Western silver, defeat of the wheat. Victory of letter files and plutocrats in miles with dollar signs upon their coats. Diamond watch chains on their vests and spats on their feet. Victory of custodians, Plymouth Rock, and all that inbred landlord stock. Victory of the neat. So you don't have to be a populist to, and I'm not, to enjoy this expression of this very boisterous, rollicking approach, which I think has been tapped into in different ways in this election. And I want to stress that I don't think it's represented by a single candidate, because these three elements, the ethnocentrism, the small producer egalitarianism, and the outsider style, even though they were synthesized for much of American history in this Andrew Jackson, William Jennings Bryan tradition, they don't have to be together. You can pull them apart. So, for example, I think what we see to some degree with this new populist or progressive left, and it's symbolized in many ways by Bernie Sanders, by Elizabeth Warren, senator from Massachusetts, who is actually grew up in Oklahoma, so she's an heir to this very strong Oklahoma populist tradition, with the suspicion of the banks of Wall Street, of the Northeastern financial corporate sector. You see that on the left. With Donald Trump, I think you see something closer to the classic Jacksonian synthesis, where there's a tribal element to it, and an ethnocentric and even a racist edge, where there are the others, Mexicans and Muslims, and then there's this community. But the big mistake, and I'm in the middle of the media world in Washington, D.C., is to reduce all of this to race. And the problem is, historically, American racism has involved a three-sided conflict. So it's been simultaneously a civil war within the white community, and the victims are collateral damage to some degree, African Americans, Native Americans, and so on. And the battle within the white community historically has involved the working class, and to some degree the rural, the small farmers, who see they fear that the white elite is conspiring to undercut their status and to undercut their standard of living and their wages by promoting the interests of the ethnic outsiders. So if you're trying to prevent homesteads in the West in order to leave the Indians the land, this is seen as an attack on the poor white farmer by the rich whites, who care more about the American Indians than they do about their fellow ethnics. This is true in the debates about Chinese immigration. About immigration in every period, there's always simultaneously a genuine economic threat. Because let's face it, why do businesses want to bring in great numbers of low-wage immigrants, whether from Asia in the 19th century, Europe in the late 19th, early 20th century, or other places now? There is a wage suppression element to this, which primarily affects the less educated working class people. The National Academy of Sciences had a report last week coming to the same conclusion that the previous National Academy of Sciences report in 1996 had come to, which is that low-wage immigration suppresses the wages of high school graduates and high school dropouts. Now, the New York Times portrayed this in the headline by Julia Preston: "Study shows immigrants do not take American jobs." Well, what the study shows is that low-wage immigrants suppress American wages. They don't necessarily take the jobs, but there is a wage-lowering factor, which is why business lobbies for large-scale immigration. They're not spending enormous amounts of money on lobbyists because they have a deep love of immigrants. So there's always this element of class warfare, and the lower-income whites who are most exposed to competition, whether it be from African Americans, from immigrants from Asia, Europe, whatever, tend to be the most restrictionist on immigration, the most racist in many ways because of this competitive factor. And at the same time, the elite whites, because essentially they're protected from competition, they can act on their philanthropic impulses. So that's just something to keep in mind when there's been a debate in the press recently: are Trump supporters economic populists or racists? As though you have to choose, right? The logic of this classic Jacksonian racism and populism is that it's simultaneously in favor of economic egalitarianism for the white working class, but also it's this bordered community where there's the members of, there are people who are us and there are people, the outsiders, and we want equality within, but we want to exclude other people who are a threat, to our living standards and our status within this charmed circle of the community. So I'll end, I have a few more minutes. So where's this in the future? Well, I think that given American demography and given the liberalization of racial attitudes over time, this old hard-edged white nationalism is clearly on the way out. Now, there's obviously an incentive, for people to exaggerate, the danger from it, and there's a real, there's real serious racism continues to exist in this country. But if you look at all polls, all the evidence, it declines generation by generation, and so at some point, this will cease to work as a mainstream political. It may have ceased to work now. The egalitarian portion of classic Jacksonian, William Jennings Bryan populism will be around forever. It's part of society. That is, as long as there are working class people, small businesses and so on. No matter what their race is, I think it's quite possible you will get non-white Jacksonians in the 21st and 22nd century, because at that point, the big divide is between the wealthy and well-connected and the less wealthy and less well-connected who resent what they see as the unjust privileges. And this is a phenomenon you simply see in all societies. And so I think that the ethnocentric racial aspects of the Jacksonian tradition, which are rightly abominated, are not part of its permanent legacy. I think that the suspicion of big business, the suspicion of big banks, this economic egalitarianism may very well have an afterlife long after Andrew Jackson is removed from the currency. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael Lind. Our next speaker, Margaret Washington.
Well, good evening, everyone, and I too am thankful for the invitation and for the opportunity to talk about what I think are very important issues within the context of the election, and of course within the context, from my perspective, of a great heroine, Sojourner Truth. This is my second visit to St. Olaf's. I came here years ago when it was freezing cold for Black History Month, and it cured me of ever getting on an airplane in February from Ithaca, New York. There's no doubt in my mind that placing Harriet Tubman on the $20 bill was a political move. And I think it began almost as soon as Jack Lew was confirmed as Secretary of the Treasury, and that was in 2013. Subsequently, the Treasury began solicitations for redesigns of the $10 bill. That's how it began. Many of us signed petitions, that is, those of us who were feminists, male and female, about who that should be. And the White House maintained that it was time to recognize the many contributions of American women by placing a female on the face of the $10 bill. The names that were floated, Eleanor Roosevelt, Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Rosa Parks, Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, Lucretia Mott, were all very prominent women. The fact that this process was set in motion by a Black president is instructive. The fact that the Secretary of the Treasury, Jack Lew, is an Orthodox Jewish son of Polish immigrants speaks volumes, considering the anti-immigrant stance of the Republican Party's standard bearer for the moment. So we feminists, male and female, put forth our favorite women leaders. 2013 just also happened to be the year of Harriet Tubman's centennial. That year, in the state of Maryland, her birth state, which is a slave state, was a slave state, and the federal government decided to set aside 17 acres near Cambridge, Dorchester County, Maryland, which is where she was born, for a Harriet Tubman Underground Railroad State Park and Visitor Center. Also, they designated a Harriet Tubman Underground Railroad byway, 25 miles, that Harriet trekked from Maryland to Delaware and into Pennsylvania. For many years, a group of dedicated people who loved Harriet, loved her legacy, had been lobbying to get a Harriet Tubman Park, to no avail. Finally, in 2013, they achieved that goal. Needless to say, they were overjoyed. Meanwhile, back in Washington, petitions were flowing in with names of who that should be. At that time, of course, it was the $10 bill, not the $20 bill. If we are to believe Secretary Lew, Tubman's name rose to the top. And why not? Minty Ross, as she was called, that was her birth name, was the most fearless, dedicated freedom fighter and conductor of the enslaved people's lifeline to liberty, known as the Underground Railroad. Returning south periodically we have counted over 13 times and freeing anyone willing to go, up to 60 people as far as we know, and probably more. She made that trek many times, sometimes with as many as 11 people. And if you know anything about African American history in the 19th century, anyone who was fortunate enough to escape slavery once never went back. And yet she went back over and over. She was a scout, a spy, and a nurse during the Civil War, and she led her own little band of black soldiers on many confrontations of reconnaissance, including one that brought out 700 formerly enslaved people in the Combahee River. She served 4 years in the Union Army, and she returned home, and in the process of returning to her home in Auburn, New York, she was beaten by a New Jersey conductor who dislocated her shoulder because, as a veteran, she refused to ride in the Jim Crow car. For the next 50 years after the Civil War, she was involved in suffrage. She set up a home for the elderly on her own property. She worked with African American race women. She gave interviews of her exploits and practiced general humanitarianism, always remaining poor because she would share her last crumb of bread with anyone in need. That was Harriet Tubman, who served her people and her country in war and in peace. So I voted for Harriet Tubman over my own personal favorite, who's Sojourner Truth. And nonetheless, as we know, there was wrangling, and that wrangling began in 2015, around April of 2015, about the final decision of who would be on the bill, and indeed, what bill, because the $10 bill suddenly became the $20 bill in 2015 because there was so much opposition to taking Alexander Hamilton off of the $10 bill. It's interesting that in April of 2015, Hillary Clinton made her announcement. The announcement, of course, we were all expecting. Big surprise, right, that she's going to run for the presidency. So there's a connection between that. In addition to that, in March of 2016, I took a group of American Studies students on a field trip to the Tubman home and to Seneca Falls, which is the birth of the women's rights movement, and where women for the first time proclaimed their right to have the franchise. These two sites are about 25 miles apart. And on the bus with the students, I discussed the movement that seemed to be leaning toward Harriet Tubman. And I raised the issue. Do you think Harriet Tubman would really want her face on the $20 bill, given what we had talked about in class and what I talked about on the bus, the treatment she had received, and a lot of other things? And then, a week later, the announcement came that Harriet Tubman was indeed going to be the person on the $20 bill. I think that it's certainly true that Harriet Tubman was probably, as the Secretary of the Treasury said, the name that rose to the top. There's no reason to deny that or to disbelieve him on that basis. I just think it's also interesting that these events occurred right at the time that Hillary was deciding to run for the presidency. It's also interesting that in 2008, when Hillary was basically conceding that she was not going to be the nominee and going to support Barack Obama, that she invoked Harriet Tubman. Now, this is 2008. And she invoked Harriet Tubman, and she used this famous quote, well, she paraphrased the famous quote, about keep going. If you're tired, keep going. If you're hungry, keep going. You want freedom, keep going. So the idea is struggle. So she talked about that in 2008. It was also a theme of her speech when she accepted the nomination this year. That same speech and Harriet Tubman. So she's making a connection between herself and Harriet Tubman. Courage, femininity, gender, race, and especially race and gender, and struggle, the way women had to struggle. And at one point, when Harriet Tubman was asked, she was an old woman then, she was asked by a suffragist, do you think that women should have the right to vote? And Tubman looked at her quizzically and thought for a moment, and then she, as if to say, well, why would you ask me a question like that? But she answered it, and she said, I've suffered enough to vote. So there is a definite connection between Harriet Tubman, race, and Hillary Clinton's invoking of Harriet Tubman. She called her decision, Hillary called the decision to place Harriet Tubman on the $20 bill a great historical moment. She said this in a black church in April of 2016. And again, she paraphrased this quotation from Harriet Tubman. So she uses it over and over again. So she's definitely trying to make a connection. Is there a problem with this? Well, I mean, not really. I think here you have to look at Hillary Clinton as someone who has attempted to align herself with black women. I think it's important to remember, if you don't know, I'll refresh you, that it was Hillary Clinton who was the person that invoked, as senator, the idea that Sojourner Truth should have a bust in the mall in Washington. And even though when it happened, even though black women had been lobbying for this for 8 years, it was with the help of Hillary that we lobbied. When it happened, the credit went to Michelle Obama. And the speech, the major speech in 2009 for that event, that commemoration, was made by Michelle. And Hillary, because Michelle was the first lady, Hillary had to take a back seat. So she has been, in important ways, a champion of not just black women, but women, international women as well. So you have to recognize that. Nonetheless, I think that there was a certain element of appropriation here with Harriet Tubman. And her constant reference to Seneca Falls, if you've noticed that, in her speeches and in her discussions, is instructive as well, because there wasn't a single black woman invited to Seneca Falls. And I think that's important. And it's something that she leaves out in anything she talks about in regard to women breaking the glass ceiling. The other thing that I think is instructive is the fact that women, when they were trying to get suffrage, struggled and broke. As white women, they broke as a group over the issue of black male suffrage, so that the National Women's Suffrage Association campaigned against black men getting the vote, whereas the American Women's Suffrage Association, which is based in New England, campaigned for black men to get the vote. So women were split over whether or not African American men should have the vote, and it was a very contentious situation among people who had worked very hard together to end slavery. So the history of race and gender in this country, even among progressives, is very, very convoluted. And it's something that's missing in our candidate Hillary Clinton's discussion. The final thing I want to say is, should Harriet Tubman be in our wallets? What does it mean to have Harriet Tubman in our wallets? There's opposition, and then there is approval. Could I have the slide, please? Those who oppose Harriet being on the $20 bill, and I don't mean the racists, but I mean people who admire Tubman. I don't mean Ben Bernanke, who calls it appalling. I don't mean Donald Trump, who says it's pure political correctness, and if you're going to put her on a bill, put her on the $2 bill, which doesn't exist. But I mean people who really care. People who care and are opposed say, this woman was a freedom fighter, as you can see. She fought for her people. She fought for her people's freedom as an individual and with the Army. And the most famous picture of her, as far as African Americans are concerned, is this picture that comes from her first narrative, Scenes of Harriet Tubman, with a gun. It's not the benign pictures that we see, that we're going to see on the $20 bill. That's the Harriet that they identify with. Their questions are, will this change police brutality? Will this change incarcerations? Is this the further commodification of the black female body? Putting her face on the American greenback, doesn't that undermine her legacy? Isn't that misappropriation? Isn't that exploitation? In some ways, some of the people who oppose this say it's like putting her in collusion with American empire. That empire that enslaved her and continues to be Black America's greatest oppressor. That's one perspective. The other perspective. Next slide. Representation matters. Recognition matters. Commemoration matters. Is it political correctness? Perhaps. But it is also historical correctness to have the face of a slave, a woman, a freedom fighter, a veteran, a humanitarian on the face of the $20 bill. And that way, we will always remember what she did, for whom she did it, and that it is part and parcel of the fabric of American history. And you can take your own perspective. Thank you.